Will do.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're just getting a few settings set up before we get started.
Yeah, it's not exactly letting me get access to manipulating it.
Okay. Diana, can you go ahead and make me host again, please? All right, there we go. Thank you, Diana. I am host and we're verifying that the chat is working. Thank you everyone for your patience. Always an exciting day here. Now we're getting to see where everyone's at and what's going on in your neck of the woods. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start our recording. Before we begin, just a reminder that as indicated in the registration for this gathering, by attending this Zoom webinar, you acknowledge that this session will be recorded and may be used for future presentations of the University of Arizona Global Campus, or UAGC. Welcome. We know you have many choices when selecting your professional development activities, and there are some amazing opportunities here at the University of Arizona Global Campus and beyond. We are happy that you chose to join us today, especially during the summer, as the UAGC Department of Education and Liberal Arts proudly presents to you Ed Talks. I'm Dr. Jessie Upshaw, and I'm honored to lead the Professional Development Committee of the Department of Education and Liberal Arts here in the UAGC College of Arts and Sciences, and I'll be your host for this afternoon. For those of you that are new to Ed Talks, this is not your traditional professional development webinar. Ed Talks are fashioned after TED Talks, the ever popular way of sharing concepts through personal storytelling. 2022 Ed Talks series is entitled The Power of One, Empower Our Students, which provides a foundation in the online higher education environment to develop and foster the power of meeting students where they are in their classrooms through course design, instruction, and interaction with students, and to support their skills that can transcend the online higher education classroom and stay with them long after they have met their goals. Today's session is entitled Oral Culture, Colloquialisms, and Communication in the Classroom. Here to explore and extend the UAGC's culture of care and power of one with her story, inspired by listening to students and relating through oral culture and colloquial connections, is Dr. Truby Miller. Truby, can you pop up on and say hi?
I can. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Truby. As you listen to Truby's story, you might listen for your call to action to share your practices that support a culture of care and empowerment in your classroom and interactions with students and colleagues. Or perhaps you'll find a new practice that her story or our discussion sparks for you. Dr. Truby Miller is a full-time faculty member in the Master of Arts in Special Education program in the Department of Education and Liberal Arts at UAGC. She has over 20 years of professional experience in both private and public sectors of education. Truby lives in Tennessee with her family. She has experience in many areas of education, from first practicing as a general education teacher to supervising and managing a mid-sized autism clinic as a behavior analyst. Dr. Miller earned her doctorate degree from the University of North Texas in a specialized program for school personnel and researchers focusing on the process and procedures of special education, and specifically in the treatment of autism spectrum disorders. Truby enjoys presenting hands-on learning workshops and seminars to all key stakeholders interested in teaching methodologies that are beneficial to all learners, especially those with diverse learning needs. Fun fact about Truby, to date, her most difficult time teaching behavior skills is with her husband's new lab puppy, Raider. Thanks so much for being here today, Dr. Miller. Truby, I'm now going to ask that we remove our videos so that we can get started after I give a few brief reminders. As a reminder, Ed Talks are fashioned after TED Talks, the ever popular way of sharing personal stories for only 18 minutes of monologue. We do this because we want to hear your stories, and we can best do that by sharing our stories. Our goal here is not to necessarily take or teach it, not necessarily to teach you anything new, as you are already an expert in your field. Our goal is to perhaps motivate you to try something new in your approach to helping your students succeed. Our storytelling approach is geared to not take a lot of your time, but rather to simply set the stage for an interactive conversation and perhaps encourage you to encourage your students in some new way. At the end of our Ed Talk today, we look forward to hearing your story of what you are doing or will do in your classroom or your educational setting. After Dr. Miller's story, we will invite all participants to share your own reflections and practices. So with that said, audience members, if you could please hold your comments and your chat to the end as we listen to Truby's story. Truby, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessie. And thank you for everybody being here with us today. Good afternoon again. Thank you so much for your time. Similar to Ed Talkers that have braved the waters before me, I would like to start out with several questions here at the beginning, and I just ask you to consider them throughout our time together today. So question one, how do you believe your higher education experience has shaped your life? And number two, what do you think of when someone says oral culture? And then most importantly, how do you feel about baseball? So my story starts, like most, with my formative years. Mine were largely spent in a very rural area of Oklahoma, known for being on the Oklahoma side of Lake Texoma. Now it is more known as the home of Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani's Cliffside Lake home. I'm still waiting for my invite, so I can't really tell you a whole lot about it, but I'm sure that it is beautiful. And Oklahoma, especially on Lake Texoma, was just this amazing place to grow up. We had the lake right at our fingertips, and we spent most every summer just hanging out, skiing, swimming, and really just soaking up the sun. Summer jobs as I got older consisted of working in the town that I grew up in at various places that really catered to tourists. And we had a lot of tourists in the summers. The fun track was where I spent most of my time working. We had mini golf, bumper boats, batting cages, go-karts, and then of course the indoor arcade area. I worked on the bumper boats. And the first summer that I worked there, and when I say worked bumper boats, meaning I took tickets and I explained all of these rules that we had to all the participants who never listened to anything, none of the rules. And then my favorite part was it was my duty to jump in and save anyone whose boat died unceremoniously during their time in the water. It was actually a really, really fun job. And I'm leading you all down this memory lane. I really do find myself smiling as I'm thinking of just those summers and all of the things that we got to do, and they just flew by. And then of course, school was back in session. I was not a good student. I'm embarrassed to admit I did not put near the effort into my studies as I did in saving my watering case boating friends. Most of my time in school was really focused on whatever sport was going on at the time. Fall was slow pitch softball, and winter brought my favorite basketball. And then our year ended with slow pitch softball. So much of my youth was spent just practicing and focusing on these three athletic activities. And then any leftover time I had was spent socializing with friends. And there was really nothing left for academics, no time left. I did learn really important life lessons, and I'm grateful for those. One such lesson was really how to utilize associations and find common ground and interest that ended up being common threads with people. And I started this practice or learned this lesson during my bumper boat days. I would talk with people while, they waited in these really long summer lines because there wasn't a whole lot else to do. And I would ask that age-old beginning of the conversation question, so where are you from? And then I would follow it up with whatever association that I knew from their state or their area, as long as it was something I was pretty sure that they were going to be proud of. And I did learn this lesson at that same time by associating President Clinton to one man's response from being from Arkansas. He was not a fan of that. He told me in no uncertain terms. He did not appreciate how everybody associated Arkansas with Clinton. Luckily, I knew enough about what was going on in the world of sports during that specific time. So I got us back on track by saying, man, I really apologize. So true. I'm so ready for this MLB strike to be over. Did you see Cal Ripken break that record of playing in consecutive games the other night? I had noticed earlier that he happened to have an Atlanta Braves shirt on. And since I was just positive that I was going to marry Chipper Jones back in that day, it led me to think that, okay, this guy may be a baseball fan. I bet we can get back on track here. And it did. The topic appeased him and we took off running. We talked all about the Braves' chances at the World Series, which they actually did go on and win in that time of history, which was 95. Today, I probably would have responded with something a little bit more generalizable. Like, I have to give President Clinton props for his resiliency. And I might have even said something like, the Rolling Stone gathers no moss, These types of sayings, no more formally as colloquialisms, are the old culture that I grew up surrounded by. From my high school history teacher who constantly told us, that old dog ain't gonna hunt, to my dad's warning of, sis, I believe you're getting a bit too big for your britches, meaning that I better watch my attitude. These phrases were just how people spoke, how people associated meanings where I grew up. And they generally used them to either get their point across, sometimes in a way to lighten the mood or lighten the moment, and then other times to really give a cue that things are about to take a turn for the worse. My history teacher, Coach Ship, was telling us in his old way, that old dog ain't gonna hunt, to stop whatever behavior that we were doing at the time. More than likely it was talking while he was attempting to teach us geography. And my dad was really giving me his perspective that I better stop sassing and adjust my tone and my attitude. These phrases are not geographically generalizable to each and every place, I'm positive. However, I think there are associations that can be made. In Dr. Ashante Alar's April Ed talk, she gave the example of calling a carbonated soft drink by either the descriptor of soda or pop, being a measure of where you are from, or rather where you grew up. Dr. Alar is from West Virginia in the mid-Atlantic, southeastern region of the US, whereas where I grew up in Oklahoma, that's located in the South Central region. West Virginia is somewhere around 1,120 miles from Oklahoma, and this comparison of soda or pop holds true across these geographical lines. My dad, a born and raised Oklahoman, has always called any soft drink by the descriptor of pop. My husband, who grew up a mere 60 miles away in Texas, had never heard this in his life. He calls Dr. Pepper, Dr. Pepper, and Coke, Coke, Sprite, Sprite. Speaking of my husband, his favorite movie in the whole wide world is A Few Good Men. And there's a scene in this movie between Daniel Kaffee, Mr. Tom Cruise, and his favorite newspaper vendor, where their daily routine is to only respond to each other using colloquialisms. And this movie is set in our nation's capital, in the central eastern part of the country. In the western part, in California, my family who lives there can often be heard to say, no, yeah, meaning I agree or for sure. So all of these examples show or give at least some anecdotal evidence that most of us have an oral culture we belong to and we utilize on a pretty regular basis. We might use these phrases to lighten the moment, get our point across, maybe cue our listening audience that a change is near, or possibly even share our disapproval on a topic. These phrases or social language called colloquialisms are really valuable to the culture that they belong to because they've got the power to bring about relationships by forming common threads. So after high school, I did venture into higher ed. I did so close to home, still in Oklahoma, only about 30 miles down the road. I had friends, acquaintances, pretty near my hometown as classmates as I completed my basics. And I found I really did enjoy college, and I actually put some effort into my academics this go round because I had decided to major in psychology, and I knew everything I wanted to do in the field, I was going to need my graduate education as well. I ended up obtaining my school counseling graduate degree, and I learned a whole lot more about connecting with people, developing common threads, and then just all the good that I wanted to do in this beautiful world of ours. It wasn't long until I realized one way to do this. During my very first school-based position as a school counselor, I met this certain young boy who our district was very perplexed at how to help and how to successfully educate. Later this same school year, he was identified with autism spectrum disorder, and I began to work with him on a very regimented and organized basis. And working with him was so amazing. And it motivated me to go back to school to receive more training, specifically in autism at the University of North Texas. And there I met really wonderful people who were extremely gifted, extremely talented, and already very successful professionals in their own right. I was a bit out of my depth, to say the least, but I was motivated to help my little guy the best I could. So I kept attending class, and soon enough, I felt comfortable enough to be myself, which meant speaking in the way that I grew up. That didn't seem to really fly well with one of my professors. She would tell me in private and during class, with all available to hear, that I needed to use academic language and stop using all the colloquialisms. At that point in time, I had no idea what the word colloquialism was. I had to look it up, and I remember reading it and thinking, well, I mean, this is just the way that I talk. I communicate and connect with people. I don't know how else to talk. I also practiced the unhelpful art of thinking, oh my gosh, she hates me and I'm never going to succeed and I can't do this. Obviously, not a real perfect environment to learn in. In time, what I really learned was that she expected me to use academic language in my writing and my verbal communications during academic times. I could socialize and talk really however I wanted. She was trying to teach me there's a time for academic language and there's a time for informal oral culture. I wish her lesson would have been more instructive or clear, like my other professor who taught me how to take things from the university classroom back to my campus and utilize, such as success precedes self-esteem, which my mentor, Dr. Callahan, used to say and write up on the chalkboard behind him. This was tangible and it made sense to me. I could run with it by making sure that my students felt successful before asking them to try out a new skill. Asking me to speak in a way that just wasn't my style, and in a way that I really had no background experience in, was a really difficult task for me. I can remember concentrating so diligently on forming my responses in her class that I didn't comprehend anything that she was teaching. I didn't comprehend any of the core lesson, which then meant I had to go back home and I had to study and reteach myself. I was working full-time as a school counselor by then. I had clients after the school day had ended, and my drive time to class was about an hour and a half twice a week. I hardly saw my husband. In the middle of our program, we had our first son. So in my Oklahoma terms, I had a lot of irons in the fire. I know, another colloquialism. On one of my trips from work to class at UNT, this country song came on the radio. I hadn't heard it before. One of the lines said, "Don't outsmart your common sense." And for some reason on that drive, that just spoke volumes to me. And I knew something has to give. I can't continue to go through class being unable to pay attention and then take the remainder of the week to relearn and reteach everything that the class covered. There really wasn't even a reason for me to attend if it was going to be that way. I needed this professor to listen and really hear me, not just concentrate on my words and the form of my words, but the function, really the intent behind them. So far, she had really missed the boat in doing so. When I explained with her what I had been doing, the toll it was taking, she was generally just shocked. She'd never meant for her instruction of speaking academically to be taken so rigid. She explained her perspective and just the responsibility overall that she felt in teaching and training her students how to speak technically and formally. And I hadn't thought of it that way. And that did make sense, and I understood. So we negotiated that when I was teaching in an academic environment, I would only use academic language. And we agreed I would co-teach with her, so she could help shape these behaviors. The course I co-taught with her was really an extremely beneficial learning experience for both of us, I think. While I learned I actually could teach the content using only academic language, she and I both learned that when I brought an association into the mix, one appropriate for students and the course, and I used colloquial phrases to hammer a point home, they learn more, as long as I attach the meaning correctly, accurately. The co-teaching experience, just the whole experience was to learn how to teach effectively. I'll be forever grateful for it, and to her. Albert Einstein once said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. I think he was telling us to listen and explain in associations or colloquial terms if beneficial. Understanding the content and teaching it in academic terms while tying it to association and students' background learning experiences through colloquial phrases has been beneficial to students in my experience. It's definitely beneficial to me when I'm at a conference or a workshop. I understand it better. Doing this does, however, take some preparation strategies, such as requesting students complete an assessment focused on their background and training, their likes, their dislikes, maybe their feedback preferences, how they feel they learn best. I have found if I leave a blank area and just ask them to tell me just anything that they think will be helpful for me to teach them in the most beneficial way, that they use it. So using this feedback really allows me to also know which specific colloquialism will be helpful to embed in the overall course, and then which ones I either need to attach meaning to before I utilize them, or maybe just leave out altogether. And of course, like everything, sometimes this is easier said than done. One specific student from South Africa stands out in my mind when I think of barriers or potential obstacles to employing this strategy. Most of our states and regions have some type of similar oral culture like we talked about earlier, but our international regions, the social language may cause more confusion than actually building common threads. And I learned this while teaching in West Texas. I met this beautiful soul who was a mom of 4. Her husband had stayed in South Africa while she and their children came to Texas to earn their education. And it was clear that she had worked diligently on mastering the English language that she really felt would be beneficial in her pursuits and her goals. But pragmatics and social language wasn't so easily understood for her. So when we had our first class and I was asking all of my students, please complete this voluntary preference assessment and explaining the rationale of why I was asking that, it was very perplexing to her. And so she stayed after class and, asked some questions. Why did I want this information? And so we just completed it together. And this began a very long professional rapport that we had, and a lot of future sessions of her staying after class so we could talk through things. The colloquial phrases I used were just so new to her, and they presented with confusion instead of this beneficial association that I intended. So I set out to create a course overview with our weekly learning objectives and weekly activities, and I added the phrases that I knew I would use in each of our class meetings. Then I took each phrase and I added an explanation I knew she'd understand. I put this little different course map on our course platform. I think we were using Blackboard at the time. And I gave every member of the class a permanent product copy, and most of them didn't think up too much about it, but it was extremely beneficial for her. And she ended up graduating from our undergraduate program and went on to obtain her graduate degree in education. The overview of the course was so helpful and beneficial for her that I decided just to go ahead and use it in the rest of my courses. Of course, adding little revisions and tweaks throughout the years. But listening to her really helped me become a much better educator. And it was interesting to see how she would utilize this social language with her peers when class wasn't going. So what I would really love for all of us to consider is just to really listen to our students, not the form of their words, but their intent, their function, their perspective, because they are sharing themselves with us. And then it becomes much more possible to develop our common threads, looking for ways to lift our students up and just listen to them. So when we started on this oral culture journey, there were 3 questions that I asked. The first, how do you believe your higher education experience has impacted or possibly shaped your life? If this question ran through your mind during this ed talk, or you thought of a visual imagery right off the bat, it might mean that your life has definitely been shaped by one or more of your higher education experiences. I know mine did in many ways, specifically with this emphasis on intertwining academic language with my own oral culture background instead of being ashamed of it. I would really love to hear your stories after these next 2 questions. What do you think of when someone says oral culture? This can have so many meanings since our language and communication styles are wonderfully diverse and reinforced just through a variety of experiences. Dr. Donna Beagle, pioneer author, researcher, speaker, and owner of her own business, Communication Across Barriers, conducted a food study in collaboration with the FDA back in 2016. And the result was that it changed the way food safety is addressed and actually taught. The training was entitled the FDA's Oral Culture Learner Project, helping employees understand the importance of food safety. In her study that was utilized for this training, Dr. Beagle states that many times training is provided in language that is not familiar to learners. It's too technical. And it's presented in a way that does not relate to food employees in this study, their personal experiences. So listening to our learners by taking the time to understand their oral culture, develop common threads between these technical course topics and their more personal or familiar colloquialisms may actually help increase their understanding of these topics, just as it did in the FDA study. And then our last question, which I facetiously listed as our most important. How do you feel about baseball? Having spent the majority of this summer watching my 16-year-old and his travel baseball team play across 4 different southern states, I have heard some of the best examples of oral culture. One of the best phrases I've heard this summer is from a papa giving his grandson's team a heads up that they needed to pay attention to the base runners by yelling, "There are ducks on the pond." Thank you all for taking this journey with me. I would love to hear your thoughts, responses, stories, and questions. Back to you, Jessie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. The theme of finding common threads and connection from your story shines through like the blazing sun on this hot summer day in Texas, if I can use a colloquialism. But more so the emphasis on truly listening to our students as they adjust between academic and conversational language to their intent. Being ready to pivot our instructional practice by truly listening to their intent and examining the value of oral culture and colloquialisms and connecting to material and each other. As Truby emphasized her professor, Dr. Callahan's reminder that success precedes self-esteem, I would add that self-esteem also precedes future student success. And both pieces we as faculty, advisors, leaders, and other student support professionals have an impact on. Truby has posed some questions for us to consider here as we reflect on our own practice, looking through that lens of empowering our students. For those of you here today, we are ready to open up those chat lines for you to consider your takeaways from today's story. Let's frame our discussion. What are you currently doing in your practice to support student success? What are you inspired to do next? Please start sharing your impression, your ideas, and perhaps your new approach in the chat. Be sure your chat is set to everyone. We would also love to hear from you. To share with us using your audio, simply raise your hand using the hand icon on the bottom of your screen. You will then be given the opportunity to unmute your microphone and share your story or reflection that way. We invite you to join the conversation now to inspire others with your story. And Truby, it really spoke to me when you were talking about that opportunity for feedback on preferences. And it screams to me what the value of our post-year introduction forum can be for really finding out more about our students and then finding ways to relate to learning a little bit more about where they come from and how we can then make those connections using some of that oral culture and those language pieces. So that really sparked for me as you were speaking of an additional way to use that post-year introduction forum.
Thank you. Yes, I can definitely. The very first class I taught at UAGC, there was a student from Oklahoma, and of course we had a whole lot of associations that we could make, but it was also interesting to see all of the other students then jump in and say, you know, we may not have that one, but here's the one that we have where I'm from, and it was fun, good learning experience.
Roseanne, thank you so much for sharing in the chat some additional resources to Dr. Donna Beagle and Communication Across Barriers. For those of you that are less familiar, clicking on that link will bring you to a great many resources in addition to the ones that we share along with our Ed Talks. So thank you, Roseanne, for sharing that. Julie shares here meeting with a student just today over Zoom and going over the paper, asking questions because she did not quite fully understand what the writing was. Mm-hmm. And the student was able to explain it much better face-to-face over Zoom. So it made sense. And it really does speak to that value of going beyond the print culture to the oral culture as we extend our instructional practices. Thank you, Julie.
Roseanne, I actually did go back and look at a lot of that study. It was so interesting. And interesting that the FDA really took all of her research and her recommendations, and it was wonderful what all they had done with it. And it would make a whole lot more sense to me as, you know, a food service person to learn that way, I think.
Carla, thanks for that feedback. And I also thought the same thing about when we come across a student's use of colloquialism in their writing or perhaps in a message back and forth. Sometimes it may give pause, thinking back to Dr. Ashante Aller's presentation on academic language and barriers of academic language. But framing it this way, where the student's intent is to make the connection and giving that opportunity to extend beyond, it really does, as you said, provide food for thought. Thank you, Harla. Would love to hear any stories anyone has related to how your higher education experience has shaped your life. Oh, I see Jackie coming on camera. Jackie, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could, I'd just like to real quick say bravo Zulu for creating this green zone, and Charlie Mike, Roger out. Which is kind of weird to say to this group, but my military affiliated students know exactly what I'm talking about. And as Truby mentioned that in her first course, she connected with a student from Oklahoma. I find we have a lot of sayings in the military world, and myself being retired, that I can easily connect with my students. I will, on a military paper, if it's, you know, from a student on a military paper that they turn in, Bravo Zulu means job well done. So a lot of times I'll just do that, put a B and a Z and maybe an exclamation mark behind it, and they'll understand that. And a green zone is, they know that's a safe space. And so we try to create safe spaces. And Charlie Mike, I'll tell them, you know, that you know, keep doing what you're doing. Charlie Mike, continue your mission. And then obviously Roger out is I'm done talking. So with that, Roger out.
Heard loud and clear, Jackie. Thank you. I'm seeing in the chat, Debbie giving an example of really pulling that quote of self-esteem preceding success, and how we often hear from our students that they nearly quit because they aren't finding that success. I'll use Debbie's words. It can't be stated strongly enough, the importance of listening and learning about our students, making the connections that make them feel safe and trusting us. Educators make a profound impact. Thank you, Debbie.
Dr. Callahan's success precedes self-esteem. When I was a school counselor, I had all my IT guys absolutely hated this, but I put all of these quotes and different things that would be helpful to me throughout the day all over my computer screen. And that success precedes self-esteem was so helpful to me to remember. You know, I'm asking someone to do something that's really hard for them. So I've got to make sure that they're successful first. I had two other professors that would do lots of quotes. And one of them was, don't put all your self-esteem eggs in one basket, by Dr. Collins. And I have used that with my own kids, I don't know how many times. And the third one was, an opinion changed against its will is of the same opinion still. I try to remember that as well.
It's a great one too. I'm gonna have to write all these down from the recording. Kimberly and Shaylee are emphasizing the importance of the human factor and really using a person's oral culture to make them feel at home in our academic culture, which I think really does speak to what we've been talking about of self-esteem and reaching for success. And Joyce mentions having students that may have different needs, needing the support for calls every week, that oral culture, just wanting to talk, and it built the confidence and helped clarify the questions and expanding that oral culture. Now, all good things must come to an end. I'm seeing some wonderful stories being shared still in the chat. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives on the impact that you've had, and the approaches and ways that we can use colloquial language. But we must respect our time and move forward. But before we let you go, we do want to provide you with an opportunity to download your certificate of participation. It's also available on our website. You can see that in the chat. If you're here with us live, you'll be able to download that. And if not, you'll see it linked there in the recording. If you're on a mobile device, you'll be able to find the link on the homepage. We want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Donna Beagle and Communications Across Barriers, as well as the members of the UAGC community for the dedication to the work of the culture of care and power of one. Please do mark your calendars for every third Thursday, same time, same place, to continue our series and discussion. And next up, please come back and see us for the next session on August 18th, as Dr. Newton Miller brings us the story of equitable access to mastery, which I have the honor to host, and we hope you do not miss this story. We thank you for joining us today. A huge thank you again to Dr. Truby Miller for sharing with us today to inspire our next steps in supporting our students and each other. On behalf of Department Chair Dr. Denise Maxwell and UAGC's College of Arts and Sciences Department of Education and Liberal Arts, we wish you a safe, healthy, and impactful July, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, everyone.